Hello, I'm Esther. I'm chair of the Socialist Labour Network, and I'm chairing the meeting for this evening. And this meeting, Never Again, means never again for everyone, has been arranged by the Socialist Labour Network in partnership with Jewish Network for Palestine and the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Today is Holocaust Memorial Day. Soldiers of the 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front of the Russian Army opened the gates of Auschwitz concentration camp 80 years ago today, on January the 27th, 1945. We are holding this meeting to remember and commemorate all the victims of the Nazi Holocaust. The Holocaust was perpetrated by the Nazis and right-wing collaborators across Europe against at least 6 million Jews, also Roma and Sinti Gypsies, disabled people, 3 million Russian prisoners of war, and up to 3 million Poles, as well as millions of Russian civilians. In total, it's estimated that 15 to 20 million people died in the Nazi Holocaust. We are holding this meeting to say never again for everyone, including the people of Gaza who've been destroyed on a mass scale in the present conflict. We welcome our speakers this evening, all of whom bring their perspectives to past and present genocides. We will hear from our speakers and then we'll have time to take contributions and questions from the floor to the panel, concluding with final remarks from the panel members. Our speakers tonight are Dr. Ghada Karmi, Rania Khalek. We're hoping to see Tariq Ali, although he has said he's not well, so he may not be able to join us. Stephen Kapos, Ronny Kasrils, and Tony Greenstein. Suzanne Weiss was listed to be on our panel, but she's unable to join us. So Mick of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign will read out her message to the meeting shortly. Suzanne was born to immigrant Jews in Paris in 1941. She found refuge with a farm family between 1943 and 1945. After losing her parents in the war, Suzanne was adopted by a New York family in 1950 and has been active throughout her life in a variety of social justice movements. Suzanne's memoir, Holocaust to Resistance, My Journey, was published by Filmwood in October 2019. So I'm going to pass over to Mick now to read out Suzanne's statement and also say a few words, I think, about Ali's arrest. Over to you, Mick.
Thank you, Esther. This meeting is so important. Ali, the last I heard, was still in detention, was still under arrest. We know the Israelis have killed a couple of hundred journalists. We know that journalism, in a sense, has been killed in Britain in the mainstream media. And in that situation, journalists, real journalists, like those at Electronic Intifada, and especially perhaps Ali Abu Nima, are very important for us.
Sorry, can you hear me? There was news that just actually came out about Ali. He's been officially deported from Switzerland.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Set that out. I thought that would be important to mention, but please continue what you were saying because it's all still relevant.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think one of the best responses we can make to Ali's detention is to try as hard as possible to get more subscribers to Electronic Intifada, because they're obviously such a threat that the Swiss had to deport Ali. Suzanne Weiss is very, very upset that she couldn't make it tonight. Here are her words. How I wish I could participate in the Holocaust Memorial meeting. I'm incapacitated because of recent surgery and continue to recuperate in hospital. Without a computer and my files, it's difficult for me to compose a message expressing all that I want to say. But I'm hoping the following few words will be appropriate and adequate. As a Holocaust survivor, the term never again is a determined pledge I deeply feel. I believe that the tenacious Palestinian struggle has given a more universal, broader, and profound meaning to those words. During the Second World War, millions of people understood fascism and Nazism as racist ideologies. Today, Zionism is waging a genocide of vengeance with the complete eradication of the Palestine people in mind and their struggle against Israeli apartheid. It's generally understood by the world's supporters of Palestinian freedom that Zionist fascism is not only racist through and through, but also that it is inspired by settler colonialism, the goal of which is seizing the land, natural resources, and acquiring some cheap labour at any cost, at the cost of the survival of future generations. In their fight to regain their homeland, Palestinians have taught the world the meaning of resistance. The US and Israel never imagined the strength, the will, and the determination of the Palestinians in this struggle against subjugation and oppression. The Palestinians have won Gaza against all odds. Their resolve and courage has shown us the way. It has become evident that the US and Israeli-led devastation of Gaza is part of a larger and wider battle with the goal of disenfranchising the people of the Middle East and robbing them of their land, resources, and independence. The US-Israel alternative is annihilation, and never again thus takes on new meaning for us. It has become clear that the Palestinian carnage at the hands of Israel and the US has never been in defense of the Jewish people. Israel abuses the horror of Hitler's Holocaust to say that Jewish people needed their own country to escape anti-Semitism. Zionism is not Judaism, but Israel has led a world witch hunt directed against the Palestinians to confuse the two. If you criticize Israel's policy of extermination, you're labeled as an anti-Semite. Tony, you get a mention. Our Tony Greenstein and Asa Winstanley of Electronic Intifada are among the many challenging and combating this attempt to silence the Palestinian voice and presence. We must defend them and all who are under attack. I am proud that in demonstrations throughout the world, Jewish people are seen in large contingents living up to our heartfelt never again. We raise our voices in support of the Palestinian people and for the rights of all humanity. The resistance initiated on October the 7th, 2023 by the Palestinians is indeed a struggle for all humanity. We in the diaspora must and will continue to support the Palestinians, the Lebanese, and all the peoples of the Middle East in every way possible. The BDS movement is a powerful tool to seriously challenge and isolate the manufacturers and distributors of the war machine. With BDS, we represent our united power with heartfelt conviction in organising people in action for a brand new world. Never again for anyone. From Suzanne Weiss.
Thank you very much, Mick. Thank you for that really rousing message from Suzanne. I want to hand over to Tony now because Tony is going to show us a short video, which I think is Suzanne speaking at a meeting.
So I learned that the Holocaust took place in the context of the Second World War, and that the Second World War was in fact a continuation of the First World War. It was a war for world power. And Hitler sought to reconquer German territory that had been confiscated at the end of the First World War. He sought to make reconquered territory, reconquered territory for Germany. only for German people. He wanted to reconquer that territory that was lost in the First World War. And he used the Jewish people, a small minority in Germany and in fact in Europe, as a scapegoat. He blamed the Jewish people for both the wars and every and any problem Germany had.
Mm.
So Nazism was based on racism, white supremacy, supremacy of the male over the female, colonialism, patriotism, and inhumanity. That's part of my conclusion.
I'm going to move on then to invite Ghada to speak. So Dr. Ghada Karmi is a British Palestinian doctor who was expelled by the Zionist militias in 1948 from her home in Jerusalem. We're really delighted to have you here this evening, Ghada. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm glad to have made it, because I'm afraid I have fallen prey to the flu epidemic, which is ravaging London. But I am well enough to join this really important meeting. And my thanks, my heartfelt thanks really, to Tony Greenstein and his colleagues in having set up these meetings, not just this year, but the year previously, and I hope he continues to do that. Okay, look, my understanding of Holocaust Remembrance Day is that it should be made of two components. The first is, of course, remembrance of the victims, whether they were Jews or whether they were Gypsies or whoever else. So the remembrance is very important. But there is another aspect which I think is even nearly more important. And that is the aspect which says we must never allow this kind of thing to happen again. Now, I've been struck by the fact that we are currently living through a genocide which is being enacted before our eyes, the genocide in Gaza, yet the first year, which was 2023, at the beginning of 2024, I mean, when this Remembrance Day occurred, and now in 2025, no official mention of the war in Gaza. Now, I know that there are, if you look up, and you will see that there are mentions of other genocides. They're mentioned as Serbia, let's say, or Rwanda, but not a word about Palestine, not a word about Gaza. And yet we are living at a time when the International Court of Justice is at the moment considering the allegation of a plausible genocide taking place in Gaza, and yet, despite that, it doesn't make any difference. You see, this goes back a very long way. It is not a matter of what's happening now or last year or any of that. It goes back a very long way. In reality, the Palestinians should have had no role to play in a European story. This is the story of the Holocaust, the German Nazi movement, and what it did in Europe is a European story. The victims are European, the perpetrators are European. They have nothing to do with the Middle East, and certainly nothing to do with the Palestinians. However, the Palestinians were forced into the narrative. They were forced into the narrative in order to fit the idea of the necessity of setting up the state of Israel and maintaining it ever since. And I don't have to remind listeners what are the components of this narrative. And of course, first, it's the Bible and the events of the Old Testament took place supposedly in the land of Palestine. And so the idea that the ancient Israelites are the ancestors, the direct ancestors of these Jews from Poland and Lithuania, took hold. So you've got the Bible, and of course, there's anti-Semitism. The Zionists tried very, very hard, repeatedly over many years, to pin the accusation of anti-Semitism on Palestinians, when there is no evidence of that whatsoever. Nevertheless, you know, as well as I do, that when the Mufti, the Grand Mufti, the leader of the Palestinians in the 1940s, met together with Hitler during the beginning of the Second World War, this has been seized on by the Zionists as evidence that he supported the genocide of Jews. So there's that. There's, of course, the immense takeover of Palestinian history and culture on the basis that it is somehow related to the ancestral history of these European Jews who were imposed on the land of Palestine and formed the Israeli state. And nothing has been more I think, offensive than the pretense of an affinity amongst Zionists, that there is an affinity between them and Palestinian Arabs like me on the basis of, quote, fellow Semites. This is false in every single way and highly offensive to the Palestinians. So really, I have to tell you, the fact that there is no mention of Gaza, of what is happening to the Palestinians, is not only offensive in itself, but there's another reason. You see, when you work so hard as Zionists to link the Palestinian people, their history, their culture, their presence in the land, to link it with a supposed ancient Jewish presence and the supposed descendants of those Jews, it's an active process. It's not just a mention. It's an active process. So it's dragged Palestine into the whole Holocaust story. And as a result of which, Gaza and what's happening in Gaza and what's happening to the Palestinians should be one of the most important and prominent aspects of Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I finally just want to say that so long as that is not the case, so long as the Palestinians are omitted from the list of genocides, and as you know, there is lip service to genocidal events in many places, while at the same time asserting the primacy of Jews and what happened to Jews, as long as there is no mention of the victims of these Jews, the victims, the Palestinian victims, for me, Holocaust Remembrance Day, it detracts from its importance and its meaning. And that is very sad.
Thank you very much, Ghada. The idea that absolute truth that Palestinians have nothing to do with the Holocaust, but the Palestinians are paying is something that we should all be really, really aware of and shout long and hard about it. So I'm just going to check with Tony now whether he thinks we've got the Suzanne clip?
No, I'm going to leave it.
No, all right then.
It.
So in that case, I'm going to invite Rania Khalek to speak next. Rania is a Middle East-based journalist. Not sure where you are at the moment, Rania, for Breakthrough News. Over to you, Rania, and welcome to our meeting.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm speaking to you from Lebanon, where we just had the end of the 60-day ceasefire supposedly yesterday. And I'm sure many of you saw the very powerful images of Lebanese people returning to their villages in the south, chasing out the Israelis, despite, you know, Israel shooting and killing up to 22 people. It was still a day of warmth and a feeling of some kind of victory, because people have sacrificed and lost a lot, but they have not been kicked off their land. And we saw some images of from Gaza today that were also equally heartwarming to see people and Palestinians going back to their, you know, homes in northern Gaza, or what's left of them, just being able to go back when Israel had wanted to, you know, eradicate their presence forever and failed. So we should also commemorate that. But, you know, we are, you know, I also want to say it's an honor to be speaking alongside such an all-star cast of people. And it's always a pleasure to participate in anything that Tony Greenstein puts together. So thank you for inviting me. And obviously we're here to speak on Holocaust Remembrance Day. And it's strange, isn't it, that on a day that's supposed to be about remembering the Holocaust, we're having a conversation about a genocide everybody's ignoring and using this Holocaust to justify another one. But I'm glad that we have a space where we can talk about that. And so I'm just going to kind of go through some of my thoughts and some of my notes based on just kind of like what comes to mind for someone like me, you know, on Holocaust Remembrance Day. And yes, we're supposed to remember the horrors of the past, but also it's really important that we do what we're doing, which is to confront this brutal reality of the present. You know, never again wasn't meant to be this empty slogan wielded by the powerful to justify new atrocities. It was meant to be this commitment to preventing the repetition of genocide, and to go further, apartheid and ethnic cleansing, no matter the victims, no matter the perpetrators. Yet today, the lessons of the Holocaust have been distorted, have been manipulated, weaponized to fuel the very crimes they were meant to prevent. I don't think I'm telling you anything new when I say that. And so, you know, some of the things that sit with me when I think of all these things as a person who's Lebanese, who's been raised in the West, but also American, who's always also felt Palestine to be a part of who I am, regardless of, you know, whatever borders a bunch of Europeans chose to draw to carve up the spoils of the Levant. With all that in mind, one of the distortions that's kind of at the front of my mind when it comes to when we talk about the Holocaust, and also confronting what Zionism has done, is how Zionism has really tried to hijack Judaism. But I want to hone in on the impact that has had on Arabs. There was currently this debate online about this discomfort some Arabs were expressing that they feel when they see the Star of David, right? Which is the sacred Jewish symbol. It's very important, I guess, you know, it's very important to Jews, but, you know, some people went so far as to call that discomfort a form of bigotry. But I don't think it's bigotry. I think it's just fear, especially speaking to you from Lebanon. You know, why do I say it's fear? It's because the settler colonial state has placed the Star of David on its flag, on its warplanes, on its tanks, on its soldiers' uniforms. Israeli forces, when they invade Palestinian homes and Lebanese homes as well, they leave behind not only destruction, but hateful graffiti under the banner of the Star of David. All across southern Lebanon, there's, you know, Star of David graffiti. In 1982, when the Israelis occupied up to my village, they occupied my grandmother's home. They left Star of David graffiti with hateful messages. Israeli settlers have burned the Star of David into the skin of their victims, into the flesh of Palestinians, which, you know, sounds like actually a pretty anti-Semitic thing to do, right? To commit your crimes under the cover of the Star of David. And yet the world demands that Arabs overlook this, that they ignore how their pain and suffering have literally been branded with a symbol once meant to signify a religion. And so what does it say that we live in a world where Arab fear of the Star of David, based on very material concerns I just explained, evokes more outrage than the ongoing burning of Palestinian children under this banner? And I would say, you know, if this really upsets anyone, the blame lies not with those who fear it, but with those who have weaponized it. And this distortion that I'm talking about extends beyond symbols. The West, which is, as Ghada reminded us, perpetrated and enabled the Holocaust, not Arabs, the West did that, has long sought to project its own anti-Semitism onto Arabs, attempting to shift blame and responsibility onto those who had nothing to do with it. Arabs did not commit the Holocaust. Yet today, we're treated as though we have to pay the price for Europe's crimes, specifically Palestinians first and foremost. Reparations, once intended to be an idea for justice, have in this case materialized as German-supplied Dolphin-class submarines that have nuclear-armed capabilities to the state of Israel, further entrenching a military occupation and oppression in the name of reparations for the Holocaust. And then there's the issue, another issue that comes to mind when I think of this day, is the issue of Arab Jews, right? This is a community that Zionism claims to represent, yet has systematically erased. The project of Zionism uprooted Arab Jews from their homes, their cultures, and their identities, and replaced their rich, millennia-old heritage with a European settler identity that sought to erase their deep connections to the Arab world. Instead, putting on them, projecting onto them, European Jewish history. They were absorbed into a colonial framework that has demanded they abandon their language, their traditions, and their sense of belonging. And it's particularly grotesque that the crime of the Holocaust has been invoked my entire life to justify further crimes in the Middle East. I mean, what greater insult to the victims of this horrific European crime than to see Jewish suffering used as a shield for ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocide? It's just, you know, we see genocide used as a pretext to literally commit genocide, to repackage occupation as self-defense, and dehumanize an entire people. It's so sick, and it's an affront to every victim, Jewish or otherwise, who perished in the European Nazi genocide. And speaking of history, let's also not forget what's often erased from the narrative, which is the Zionist collaboration with the Nazis. And to that, I just want to pull out Tony's book, which is one of my favorite books, Zionism During the Holocaust. I seriously, a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine here in Lebanon, has passed this book out to people because it's such important documentation of something that's never talked about, ever talked about, is the way that Zionist leaders engaged in deals with the Nazi regime. They prioritized their nationalist goals over the lives of millions of European Jews. And these uncomfortable truths are never reckoned with because, you know, they challenge the simplistic narratives of good versus evil that are used to justify Zionism today in the Middle East. And then we also have to look deeper when we talk about Holocaust remembrance into the roots of the Holocaust itself. The Nazi regime didn't invent genocide from thin air. They actually borrowed it. The inspiration for the Holocaust came from colonial practices that the US and European empires had long perfected. The racial laws of Nazi Germany were directly influenced by American segregation and eugenics policies. And Germans aren't even taught in their own country about their own country's genocide in a place like Namibia, where they slaughtered thousands of people in a precursor to the Holocaust. Why? Because recognizing these connections would expose the global history of colonialism, imperialism, forces that ultimately turned inward and fueled fascism's rise as a weapon against communism. But beyond these historical portrayals, something else that comes to mind when I think of Holocaust remembrance is that we have to understand the strategic function of Zionism in today's world, right? Imperialism is literally using Jews as human shields for empire. And Zionism is not separate from imperialism. I know everybody loves to have this debate about whether it's the Israel lobby running things or the Americans running things, but the US is not separate from Israel. Israel's interests are US interests. The West threw everything it could muster at the people of Gaza. And still, we saw the images of people today returning to northern Gaza. Israel failed to exterminate them. But why did the West back Israel's genocide? It's not because of some Israel lobby, but because Israel's a military outpost of the West. It fights Western adversaries so the US doesn't have to. And by adversaries, I mean any group or country that doesn't follow American dictates, that seeks to forge a path independent of empire's interests, countries like Iran, movements like Hezbollah, which is why the West embarked on this multi-billion-dollar effort. They literally threw billions, tens of billions of dollars at Israel to get rid of Hamas in Gaza. Israel literally killed Nasrallah. It took out its Hezbollah's senior leadership. It did weaken Hamas, though of course they didn't eradicate it. It weakened Iran. It broke the resistance axis without a single American soldier dying. That's the purpose of a country like Israel. It's a tool of U.S. empire. It doesn't mean it came out victorious, but it's important to note that. It also does mean that this concern about anti-Semitism is fake, because what's more anti-Semitic than weaponizing Judaism for empire, than putting Jews from around the world on the front lines of fighting to maintain US-led dominance over the world? What's more anti-Semitic than turning the world's oldest monotheistic religion into a vehicle for colonialism, than using the Holocaust to justify more Holocaust in the name of protecting Jews? And then just a couple more thoughts I have when I think of Holocaust remembrance, and then I'll wrap up here. I just want to note that I know Ali Abunimah was mentioned anymore, and he is a dear friend of mine and a comrade who taught me so much about how to do journalism fearlessly and with dignity. I look at him as somebody who really mentored me. And he was arrested by these depraved Western authorities in Switzerland because they're so civilized. And he was persecuted for exposing Israel's crimes. He was literally arrested for telling the truth. It's outrageous, but it's not surprising given the silence that we've seen, indifference, shrugging of shoulders, and even in some cases justification from the West towards Israel murdering over 200 journalists in Gaza. The imperialists today are more depraved than ever. And they use never again while being more depraved than ever. You know, some see never again as this empty slogan, like I mentioned earlier, that selectively applies to some atrocities while justifying others. But I would actually argue in many ways it's become a weapon. Like, how sad is that? That when I hear, I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but when I hear never again from a Western government official, or when I hear them invoke the Holocaust, I actually get scared because I know they're about to use it to justify something horrible, probably against my people. How sad is that? The Holocaust doesn't just haunt Jews, it literally haunts the entire global South. Never again should not and cannot mean safeguarding one people's dignity at the expense of another's annihilation. It should be obviously never again for anyone, never again to genocide, to apartheid, to colonialism, to ethnic cleansing, whether in Europe or Palestine or anywhere else in the world. And to actually honor the victims of the Holocaust is to fight for justice, not just for the past, but for the genocide happening today. It is to recognize that the same forces that enabled the Holocaust, racism, settler colonialism, imperialism, are alive today, and they have to be resisted in all their forms. And that means we can also never forget what they did in Gaza, what they're still doing to Gaza. We can't let all those martyrs have died in vain. We should be letting the losses fuel revolutionary potential around the world. Because like I said, the imperialists are more depraved than they've ever been. They showed us that in Gaza. That will literally be the future standard of what punishment against defiance looks like. They have this division of humanity that's never been more stark. They treat the global South like actual garbage. So dismantling imperialism, dismantling its division of humanity, and also that comes with dismantling Zionism, is a requirement for the future sustainability of this planet and of humans in general. And that, of course, includes the liberation of Palestine. But Gaza is not going to be the end in terms of the horrors that we've seen. So I think in many ways, this is an opportunity for genuine never again. Otherwise, they'll turn the whole world into Gaza, like anything to snuff out defiance against their rotten system. And I guess, you know, that's where my mind goes when I think of Holocaust remembrance. I appreciate you all listening to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rana, for that fearless narrative outlining all the contradictions in the imperialist and Zionist stance. We heard in a previous meeting about the fact that we're looking at the dying throes of Western imperialism, and this is a desperate attempt to drag it out further. And also you're identifying, as did Ghada, about the fact that the West is projecting its anti-Semitism onto Arabs, and that the Palestinians are paying the price for that. So thank you very much for your contribution, Rana. There are lots of really positive comments in the chat that you can have a look at, and we'll come back to you at the end. It looks as if Tariq is ill and cannot attend.
No, he won't. He's ill.
Okay, okay.
He's just confirmed to me.
Oh, that's a shame.
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
So
I've
so we're
invited
now.
him for next year, if that's
Oh,
any help.
good. Okay. Yeah, and thank you, Rania, for your reference to Tony's book. We'll put the link up for everybody. If you haven't seen the book yet, it's a must read, definitely, and a totally unique text. So we're going to move on now to Stephen. Stephen is well, Stephen was born in 1937 in Budapest, Hungary, to a non-observant family of Jewish heritage. From 1944, his family was hiding from the Nazis. His father was deported to Belsen and Theresienstadt, and his mother and siblings and he were in hiding on false papers. So Stephen left Hungary for the UK following the 1956 uprising in Hungary, and he spent his professional career in the UK as an architect. Stephen was a Labour Party member from 1997 until I think 2023 in St Holborn and St Pancras CLP with Starmer, until he was suspended by the Labour Party following his speaking at our meeting on Holocaust Memorial Day 2 years ago. So welcome, Stephen. It's good to see you. And over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. With your permission, I will be concentrating on a series of short episodes, events of the World War II Holocaust in Budapest, with direct or indirect connection to my own lived experience. I can find no more fitting way of keeping the memory of the victims alive. We all know about the horrors of the camps and the massacres of the SS special groups in occupied parts of the Soviet Union, but elsewhere too, the horrors and dehumanizing atrocities were all pervasive. I repeat first that with these stories, we are in 1944 Budapest, mostly after the German occupation of March 1944 and the arrival of Eichmann and the Gestapo in the wake of the Wehrmacht troops. I was 7 years old, now 87. First, arrests and executions. Following liberation of Budapest in 1945, February, March, I returned to my primary school, Form 2, in late 45. We had fixed double desks for pairs of pupils, and my deskmate rather, was one Yuri George Ligeti. He was rounded up in 44 together with his mother by the Hungarian fascist militia, the Arrow Cross. They were immediately taken to the banks of the Danube, not to the stretch of steps where you can sit by the river, but to a high part of the embankment with a great drop. They were lined up with others and shot into the river. Yuri was holding his mother's hand, and they fell together, with his mother sinking at once beside him. Yuri was only shot in the upper arm, and the river took him downstream rapidly. He managed to scramble out eventually and was overlooked from a nearby building and was rescued and hidden until Liberation Day. Yuri was the brightest pupil in our class, but super nervous, traumatized for life. Secondly, torn apart families. Rules kept changing fast, and Jews weren't allowed to use public transport. Trains not at all, trams at certain times only at the rear of carriages. By that time, I was taken into hiding with a false name on false papers as Gentile, war refugee, an escapee from the advancing Red Army. We were housed in homes sponsored by the Protestant churches and the Swiss Red Cross. Housed in the same home was an older boy of about 11, 12 years of age. How did he get there? He was traveling on a crowded tram with his parents at the back of the first carriage. Being curious, he moved forward to stand behind the driver and watch him operating the levers. There was no separate driver's enclosure or compartment, only a separating bar. Suddenly, the arrow cross got on and was raiding at the next stop, hunting for Jews to arrest. His parents fell into the trap, but he himself was well separated from them and oblivious to the raid. The parents had an instantaneous decision to make, to call to him and get him arrested too, or keep him safe. They didn't call to him. They were taken off the tram and were deported to Auschwitz. They never said goodbye to each other or seen each other again. The trauma and pain of the parents' decision and of the child discovering his abandonment is not easily imagined. Life and death decisions based on mere rumors was another evil. My father and two uncles were involved with the infamous Kastner project. Rudolf Kastner, a prominent Zionist leader from Transylvania, negotiated a deal with Eichmann and Himmler himself to save about 1,600 middle-class, mostly Transylvanian Jews, in return for money and goods in kind, including trucks to be used on the Eastern Front. The saved Jews were to be transported to Belsen in transit and to be freed from there in Switzerland. I wonder, how could my father trust a deal with the SS and go to Belsen as part of a deal? The answer must lie in the alternative. The alternative was to be called up into the Jewish work brigades attached to the Hungarian army under intensely anti-Semitic officers and used as mine cleaners on the Eastern Front. But the decision, trusting your enemy, must have been agonizing, potentially being torn from the family for good. He did get stuck in Belsen and later transferred to Theresienstadt, but survived. The pain of paralysis when a loved one is threatened. My aunt Erzsi was returning her young niece, Ilonka, after a stay with her to her home in the south of Hungary. At the railway station, as Ilonka was about to board the train, she was stopped by the Arrow Cross and was arrested as an identified Jew. My aunt Erzsi was witnessing this, but couldn't intervene without also bringing arrest on her own head. I still remember my aunt's screaming breakdown on her return to home due to this trauma and sense of guilt over her inability to help. Hard to imagine the pain of the situation. Ilonka was deported to Auschwitz, but put to work there and returned. And then there was a double jeopardy of the disabled. My large Transylvanian extended farming family became seriously endangered when Hitler gifted their part of the region from Romania back to Hungary. They came under the rule of collaborationist Admiral Horthy and later of the Arrow Cross. Some of the Romanian workers were aware of their plight and offered to take them by horse and cart through secret passages to the Romanian border and into relative safety. But an elderly uncle was too fragile for such a bumpy journey, they felt, and turned down the offer. As a result, 7 adults, 6 children were taken to Auschwitz, and only 1 teenager returned. And finally, the indifference of the public, the averting of the eyes. When my father was transported to Belgium in hot, stuffy, closed wagons, soon they were desperate for water. At several stops, still within Hungary, a trade developed by the locals standing by the platforms, a gold wedding ring for a glass of water, a small illustration of the general lack of empathy, the averting of the eyes that made the Holocaust possible. In these few lived examples, important warnings are buried. Every one of them rhymes with essentially similar examples of sufferings by the heroic peoples of Gaza and Palestine. The same, but on steroids. For me, this is the ultimate message of Holocaust Memorial Day. Never again. Never again for any people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. There have been various comments in the chat saying how much they appreciate your first-hand perspective. And thank you very much for telling some of your stories. So now we are going to move on to Ronny. Ronny, can you put your video on, please? And
certainly, here I am.
I'll introduce you. So we've got Ronny with us again. Ronny is a former South African government minister and was a leading member of the African National Congress during the apartheid era. It's great to see you, Ronny. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Esther. I've been listening with intense interest to these outstanding contributions and extremely moving. And I'm honored to be with comrades here tonight. And I note that you have a huge following of participants, which is extremely important. I happened during the day to watch the events of the commemoration in Poland, the 80th anniversary. And I also was looking in at Al Jazeera, at what's happening in Gaza. And obviously, it's like we've all been seeing and experiencing through these years, and especially, and not only Ghada, my dear friend, the last 15, 16 months. The people of Gaza beginning to move back to see the rubble of their homes. And there was no connect. And the high and mighty were at Auschwitz, shedding tears. There were poignant presentations from some of the survivors. We know they would never invite somebody like Comrade Stephen Kapos. But you wouldn't have thought that Palestine existed as an example of ongoing genocide, as has been remarked on tonight. And then, lo and behold, the executive chief of the event there in Poland, with all those smarmy-wammy Polish officials pretending to be so concerned about Jewish people, by the way, one of the most right-wing governments in Europe, as we know. And I think the man's name is Ronald Lerner, clearly now with his American accent from Hungary, I think in background. And he let rip about October the 7th. He was ranting. Stephen, anti-Semitism was all about, as Ghada referred, October 7th and the Palestinians. And although there had been, dear friends and comrades, some references to the fact that it was not only the 6 million Jews, and that's a huge, huge number, but the whole range of victims, from homosexuals and Roma, as we've heard earlier, to the 3 million Russian Soviet prisoners of wars, in fact, and nothing about the 27 million Soviet people who died. But out of his mouth, there was simply that this Holocaust, this genocide, this awful genocide of the Hitler regime and fascism was simply about the Jews. And this is why it's extremely important that we have this statement, that it's about everybody. And I've seen some of the comments thus far. And of course, we understand why the Western colonial powers in the USA don't raise the issue of genocide of the Palestinians, because as comments have been streaming in here, what about the genocide that has taken place at the hands of the colonial powers from the Americas, north and south, to Africa, Namibia, Congo, 10 million in the Congo, right through to Asia, and of course Australasia, and the almost wiping out of the Aboriginal people. And this is why there's such complicity afoot. But it's more than that, because we know it's geopolitical and certainly geo-economic interests that matter to the West. So that's a fact, and a series of facts that we need to get across in our education, in the awareness that we must create throughout the world, global North and global South. Yes, I'm here in Johannesburg. We fought for our freedom against a Nazi fascist loving regime. And as I watched something of the goings on at Auschwitz, Birkenau today, the thought came across that if we hadn't freed South Africa through armed resistance and people's insurrection and the marvelous international solidarity that we received to strengthen our struggle, we could well have had those apartheid monsters still ruling. And I'll tell you this, they would have been sitting there in their suits, invited to Auschwitz. And the thought that came to mind was that these once Nazi lovers of the apartheid regime, a justice minister who became Prime Minister, J.B. Vorster, who in 1942, when they were not yet in power, he stated that what we are aiming for is a Christian national state. And he made the point that what we stand for is an ally of National Socialism in Germany. It's called fascism in Italy, and it's called National Socialism in Germany, and we call it Christian nationalism. The master race, Herrenvolk supremacy. And the point is that the same John Vorster, as a Prime Minister of South Africa, was invited to the Zionist settler colonial state, which South Africa was as well, apartheid state, as a guest of honor in 1976. And he signed the book and laid a wreath at the Holocaust Memorial Museum or Center in nearby Jerusalem. These were and had become allies in the struggle against the people of South Africa and the people of Palestine, while the ANC and the Palestinian people were united. And the alliance of apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel was no coincidence, because what they had in common is the master race ideology. The Afrikaners claimed that they came to a land that was empty of black people and they had to bring civilization. They said they were chosen by God Almighty because they had a covenant with him to defeat their enemies. And when you see the parallel with Zionism, what people need to understand, and of course comrades have been making the point, is that Zionism is an absolute racist doctrine that within it, because of that, as with Afrikaner nationalism, is bound to move as the process develops towards fascism in response to the resistance that there will always be against injustice and dispossession. And this is why we see what is happening in Israel today. Of course, Labour Party, as Ghada well knows, tried to hide exactly what the Zionist objective was, but it was there from the start, and it's come out starkly now. So let me finish on this following point about the tasks which must be before us, comrades, friends, colleagues. The Palestinian people have never faced a threat as severe to their existence as they face today. Even greater, I would say, than 1948 and what followed. The Western imperialists want the gas fields of the Eastern Mediterranean. They want to ensure at a time when they're in decline that they can control the world, and through Palestine, through Lebanon, through what was called the Levant, they will control what lies further to the east. And we know that they see in Russia and China and Iran and the global south the greatest challenge to their waning influence. So Israel is in fact the battleship, the aircraft carrier that the Bidens, the Butchers, the Reagans have always referred it to, which is why they have this green light of genocide. And when we hear Trump now speaking about the beautiful real estate that is Gaza, with its wonderful weather and beautiful sea view, we realize and we note that he's chiming in with what Zionism is all about, of taking all of the land and creating greater Israel, which is why the neighbors, including Lebanon, Syria, and the others, are all in danger. So it's the challenge to us now to intensify our international solidarity as never before, as we received in South Africa, as the Vietnamese received. We have to bring it to greater heights. That must be the marching order, Tony and others, of meetings, discourses, conscious awareness, education such as this, the mobilization that has already shaken the West and Israel in the streets, the protests, including by Jews, particularly in the USA. But what will happen when all of these Israeli captives have been returned at the end of stage 1 of what's supposed to be a stage 3 ceasefire. That is in the balance, and we can see exactly what they're aiming for. So the intensification has got to be along the lines of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. But what I wish to underline here tonight is the need for us to mobilize and organize the greatest possible pressure against the governments of the West that support Israel, that give it the green light, that provide the complicity. We have to enforce the imposing of sanctions, and we've got to end that complicity. And I want to end on the following point of mobilization, which is being germinated by the BDS movement. And certainly I'm very glad to see, of course, Comrade Roshan Dadu, our convener of BDS in South Africa here, she's with us tonight. The organization of what is being called a global energy embargo, which is key, and it's got to bring in the harbors of the world. It's got to bring in the organization of the dock workers and the trade union as never before to absolutely block the boats taking cargo to the Zionist settler colonial apartheid state as it poises to get to its final solution of the Palestinian issue. And we're talking about stopping fuel, oil, coal, energy that keeps Israel's economy functioning, but keeps its air force in the sky to bomb the hell out of Gaza and Palestine and Lebanon and Syria and possibly Iran and create further havoc. So I would say tonight, with all the passion at my age, Stephen Kapos, that I can command, we have to intensify the mobilization of the masses. And that goes, Comrade Ghada, it goes with the reinforcement of intifada, of insurrection, as happened in South Africa, when we had the international community providing that kind of solidarity to isolate the apartheid regime. Our people were inspired to greater heights. It was their struggle, their resistance that overcame apartheid. And this is what I feel should be the message emanating out from our meeting tonight and from meetings all over the world. Thank you, Esther, and everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ronnie, reminding us of the geopolitical and geoeconomic issues behind what's happening in Palestine, and the particularly useful parallels with South African apartheid. And that call about the risk of the Palestinian people being a greater risk now than ever before. I listened to any questions and any answers last weekend, and it was alarming to see how little people seemed to understand what was going in Gaza. So yes, the mobilization, the marching orders, the education, and of course, boycott, divest, sanction. We all need to be working towards more effective measures in all of those areas. And furthermore, of course, working class solidarity. So thank you very much, Ronnie. We're going to move finally on to the author of the book that's been mentioned earlier in the meeting, and Zionism During the Holocaust, to Tony Greenstein. Tony, you have 15 minutes. Over to you.
Right, thank you, Esther. I mean, that was an extremely rousing speech from Ronnie, and I completely endorse it. If at the end of phase 1 of the so-called ceasefire, Israel does start the war again, we have to restart our solidarity in earnest. There must be no acceptance of the diktat from the Metropolitan Police that we can't assemble at the BBC because some synagogue goers might be frightened. We have to defy them, and we also have to start thinking seriously about direct action that paralyzes a government that is supporting genocide in Palestine, because we know that the police will not enforce the laws that we have. Now, Ronnie spoke about the parallels between South Africa and Israel, that the land was empty, that God gave it to them. All I would say to that is, in the words of Bob Dylan, every conquering nation has God on its side. There is really nothing new about this. And of course, the Zionists had God on their side doubly so. They also began their campaign with a slogan, a land without a people, for a people without a land. And they too claimed that the return to Palestine was ordained by God. But the reality was, and people forget this, is that Zionism was always of a Christian origin. The idea of the return of Jews to Palestine did not originate with the Jews. On the contrary, when Palmerston and Lord Shaftesbury urged the border deputies in the 1840s to agree to encourage the idea of a Jewish return, they firmly rejected it. The Pittsburgh Declaration of 1885 of Reform Jewry also rejected it. Every single Jewish conclave rejected the idea of a so-called return. It was the anti-Semites, it was the Christian Zionists who took up the idea that the Jews belonged in Palestine, for the very simple reason that Zionism was the best way of getting rid of the Jews in your midst. It wasn't difficult to understand in the slightest. So Lord Balfour, he combined both anti-Semitism and Zionism. In 1905, he authored the Aliens Act, meant to keep Jewish refugees from Russia out of Britain, but he had no problem in sponsoring the Zionist settlement in Palestine. And we know, regarding the Zionist project itself, today, of course, Zionism uses the Holocaust in every which way, not just Zionism, but the Western powers themselves. And it's very interesting if we look at it, because you would think today, if you looked around at the Holocaust Memorial, there's one being built by the Palace of Westminster, there's a museum in Washington, another museum in Los Angeles, Germany has a number of Holocaust memorials. You would think that the World War, that is the last war, was being fought on behalf of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. But it was quite the opposite. The British did not want to know, and neither did the Americans, about the Jewish inmates of the extermination camps and the concentration camps. And I touch on this in my book, and I will go to it now, because I think it makes really quite interesting reading, if I can find it. Probably not. Yeah, I mean, it was Anthony Eden. He was the foreign secretary during the war, and later the prime minister during the Suez crisis in 1956. And Eden was concerned that if Britain offered to take in Jewish refugees, then, and I quote, Hitler might well take us up on such an offer. The Cabinet Committee on Jewish Refugees, which was actually renamed to exclude the word Jewish, included Clement Attlee, and it sent a memorandum to the US State Department, and this was on the 20th of January 1943, warning that there is a possibility that the Germans or their satellites may change over from the policy of extermination to one of extrusion, an aim, as they did before the war, at embarrassing other countries by flooding them with alien immigrants. And similarly, a letter sent by the Ministry of Economic Affairs to the US ambassador in London explained how, in respect of a proposal to send funds to Geneva, that the Foreign Office are concerned with the difficulties of disposing of any considerable number of Jews should they be rescued from enemy-occupied territory. Well, fortunately, of course, Hitler was quite determined to stick to the policy of extermination. So the Western statesmen and the Western countries, Anthony Eden, Churchill, Attlee, and so on, were never embarrassed in the slightest. But I think this gives an idea of the mentality. The Holocaust was known about, I mean, Auschwitz was known about almost as soon as it was created in April 1942, because the Enigma code had been broken. So it wasn't as if they didn't know, although they claimed that later, but simply because the war was never about the Jews. Today, of course, we hear nothing but the Holocaust. But at the time, the Holocaust was the least of their concerns. And the same was true of the Zionists themselves. And I quote someone else. This was Chaim Weizmann. He was president of the Zionist organization for most of its existence before the creation of the Israeli state, and then the first president of the Israeli state. And in the fall of 1937, in an issue of a magazine called New Judea, he wrote, "Palestine is no solution for the Jewish problem of Europe. Palestine cannot absorb the Jews of Europe. We want only the best of Jewish youth to come to us. We want only the educated to enter Palestine for the purpose of increasing its culture. The other Jews will have to stay where they are and face whatever fate awaits them. These millions of Jews are dust on the wheels of history, and they may have to be blown away. We don't want them pouring into Palestine. We don't want Tel Aviv to become another low-grade ghetto." So this was the attitude of the leading Zionists to what was happening. And that explains why, when most Jews reacted to the advent of Hitler by immediately launching a boycott of everything German, such that the Goring called in the leaders of the Jewish community to get them to go abroad to persuade their compatriots not to boycott Germany, the Zionists were interested in only one thing, which was a trade agreement with Nazi Germany. They were interested, and I'm talking about the leadership of the Jewish agency in the Zionist organization, in exerting and obtaining the maximum benefit from the rise of Hitler in order to build their Jewish state. And that's something, of course, which we don't hear about today. We don't hear about, for instance, how the Zionists deliberately obstructed any attempt to rescue Jews if it wasn't to Palestine. So, for example, the leader of the Zionists in America, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, when told of a proposal to send refugees to Alaska, which was not subject to immigration control because they wanted more colonists there, opposed it because he said it was too cold for people, presumably unlike the ovens of Auschwitz, which, of course, as we know, were very well heated. But this was typical of the attitude. There were numerous other proposals in terms of settlement, and all of them the Zionists opposed. And I heard today, as I think all of you have, about the arrest of my friend and comrade Ali Abu Nima by what I would call the Swiss Gestapo. No doubt the excuse and the pretext was anti-Semitism, because shutting down free speech in Europe is now essential in order to combat anti-Semitism. And it's worth reflecting on the record of the Swiss state during the Second World War and during the Holocaust, because although it was neutral, it was the only neutral country that Nazi Germany didn't invade because of its financial links, its banks, and so on. It was certainly a pro-Nazi state. So, for example, when German Jews started flooding into Switzerland as a form of escape, Switzerland insisted that Nazi Germany put a capital J on the passports of anyone who was a Jewish German, a German Jew, in order that they could be distinguished and turned back at the border. Even Nazi Germany had hesitated to do this because of the international repercussions, but Switzerland insisted on it. So the Swiss state was, from the very top, throughout the war, complicit in what was happening. And for it now to arrest and now deport a Palestinian journalist, Ali Abu Naima, is really beyond disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
I want to just say a few other things while I've got time.
You've got three or four more minutes.
3 or 4 minutes, okay. I will try and do that quite quickly. There's quite an amazing thing, really, that usually when we have historical events like the Battle of the Somme in the First World War or other events of a similar nature, the further away you get from them, the more distant they become and fall into a kind of memory hole. But with the Holocaust, it's different. Immediately after the war, no one really talked about the Holocaust except the left, incidentally. But today, it has become more and more part of a collective, if you like, imperialist memory. And the reason is quite simple. The Holocaust has been conscripted by imperialism in order to justify its plunder and genocide in the third world, in the global south. And that is important to understand. This is a completely false memory, but nonetheless, it continues. And that is why we are seeing things like Starmer, who went to the International Court of Justice and argued that the genocide in Srebrenica, where 8,000 people died, was a genocide, and in Vukovar, where 1,200 died. But apparently, according to David Lammy, his foreign secretary, the thousands who have died in Gaza, and it may well be 200,000 to 300,000, not the 50,000 who've been identified, that doesn't count as a genocide. So really, literally, we are being ruled not simply by war criminals, but by the equivalent of the Holocaust deniers who they lambast when it comes to the Nazi Holocaust. There is no difference between those who deny genocide in Gaza and those who deny the Holocaust. And anyone who is consistent should be arguing that. I have been asked to wind up. I really just want to say a very few things. In fact, I have covered most of it. So I think one of the most remarkable things is, I mean, we've seen Donald Trump, who is a clear anti-Semite, welcoming and supporting Israel in whatever it does, including proposing ethnic cleansing, which I believe actually the Biden administration supported, but it didn't do so openly. The Zionist project, which we're seeing playing out today, and incidentally, I don't accept that Israel is now stronger than ever. I think it is facing immense problems of its own. So it will be interesting to see whether they actually do resume the war in Gaza after the first phase. But we can see, I think, quite clearly that imperialism's project in the Middle East depends also on the collaboration of the Arab regimes. Without that, there would have been no genocide. If the Arab regimes, the Saudis, the Gulf Sheikhdoms, and so on, had said there is no more oil until Israel stops its bombardment, I have no doubt that very few people would have died in Gaza. And it's because of that we have to call out the absolute collaboration of the Quisling regime in Ramallah, the so-called Palestinian Authority. I mean, I'm involved with people in Jenin, where Israel is now waging war on it. But the Israeli attack on Jenin was prefigured by the Palestinian Authority's own attack on it. So we can see quite clearly that the Palestinian Authority is like a military subcontractor to Israel, just as Israel is a military subcontractor to the United States. So all of this is bound up together. But more importantly than anything, we have to reject the narrative that the Holocaust that occurred between 1941 and 1945, or 1939 and 45, if you include the disabled and the handicapped, that is any justification for the Holocaust that is taking place and has been taking place in Gaza over the last 15 months. Well, thank you very much. I mean, all the speakers have been brilliant, and this has been an excellent meeting. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you, Tony. And just a reminder to, if you're in London, to support Tony this Friday outside the Old Bailey at 9:30, where he's being prosecuted as a terrorist supporting Palestinians resisting genocide. So be there at 9:30 outside the Old Bailey on Friday, if you can. So now I'm going to invite contributions and questions from the floor, which I'll put to the panel. Please raise your electronic hand if you have a contribution or question. And thank you to those of you who've posted questions in the Q&A. The first person I should like to call is Sabi Sergal, who contacted us before the meeting. Sabi is the author of a book on genocide published in 2013, Final Solutions, Human Nature, Capitalism and Genocide. No doubt picking up many of the themes we've discussed this evening. It contains a chapter on the Holocaust, and Sabi is also completing a book on the Jewish question, which contains a section on Israel's genocide of the Palestinians. Sabi also recently contributed to a podcast on genocide as applied to Gaza Today, and is co-chair of the Camden branch of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So over to you now. Let me see if I can find you. Sabi, if you can turn your video on. Start video. Unmute. There you are. Over to you, Sabi.
Oh, yes, thank you, Chair, for inviting me to speak. And thanks to all the panelists for some really excellent and highly illuminating contributions. I'll try and keep my remarks as short as possible. Just to say, by way of background, the term genocide was coined by the jurist Raphael Lemkin in his book in the United States, published in the United States in 1944. And he defined the term genocide as the destruction of a nation or of an ethnic group. And he went on to say that genocide consisted not just in physical destruction, but in the annihilation of a group's way of life, a group's social networks, its economic, cultural, and political institutions. And there's no doubt that even before the start of the genocide in Gaza, Israel was guilty of committing genocide on the Palestinians, including Gaza. Now, just looking at the Holocaust, and thank you for referring to my chapter, the Holocaust engendered feelings of extreme anxiety, extreme rage in large numbers of Jewish people. And it swung a majority of Jews behind the concept of a Jewish state, a concept that previously had been supported by a really relatively small minority, I think, as Tony has indicated. And it was felt after the war that only such a state could protect Jews from another similar genocide. I want to move on quickly now to the work of a Marxist psychoanalyst, Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm, who was a member of the Frankfurt School, who coined the phrase social character. And he described the term social character as the essential nucleus shared by members of a group which has developed as a result of the basic experiences and the mode of life common to that group. And he talks about what he calls a productive social character, which is our ability as human beings to realize our human potential for creativity and our potential for solidarity with other human beings. But he also talks about what he describes as the destructive social character. The destructive social character is that the need to force other human beings to endure pain or humiliation without their being able to defend themselves. There's little doubt that Israeli society has developed a destructive social character. It's a psychological feature that has been necessary in order to achieve Zionism's goal of a Jewish state in Palestine, a state without the indigenous population, a state which has expelled or ethnically cleansed or murdered the majority of the original indigenous population. And I just want to talk a bit more about the kind of the psychological mechanisms involved in this destructive social character that is so predominant in Israeli society. First of all, identification with the oppressor. This is a mechanism that has been used by Zionism to deal with the fear and anger aroused by modern anti-Semitism, aroused by the Holocaust. And it was a phrase coined by Anna Freud, daughter of the great Zygmunt, of course. She described a schoolboy who would make faces, contorting his face, causing the whole class to burst out laughing. But the boy wasn't making fun of the master, as the master believed. The boy was copying the master, who was a very severe schoolmaster and was a very punitive schoolmaster. And this boy could only cope with his own anxiety by copying the master. And this is called identification with the oppressor. And clearly the history of systematic oppression of the Palestinians by Zionism carries tragic echoes of Jewish suffering in the Holocaust. But this is characteristic of Zionism, of Israeli society, that it you've got to be careful what you say these days. But there's identification with the oppressor, identification with the anti-Semites, and that is what drives that what the Zionist state has perpetrated against the Palestinian people for the last 75 years. Interesting. Jacqueline Rose wrote a book called The Question of Zion, published in 2005, and she describes an Israeli soldier ordering a Palestinian old man to stand behind a donkey and kiss the donkey's behind. And she quotes, she goes on to quote Grossman, the novelist's novel See Under, in which a 9-year-old boy, Momik, discovers photos of a Nazi soldier forcing an old Jewish man to ride another man like a horse. So it's this humiliation that was heaped on the Jews by the Nazis in the Holocaust that is replicated in Israeli society in their treatment of the Palestinian people. And Ilan Pappé, in his landmark book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, describes Golda Meir. She was, Prime Minister of Israel. She witnessed the ethnic cleansing of Haifa in 1948. And she found it hard to suppress a feeling of horror. And I quote Ilan Pappé here, when she entered homes where cooked food still stood on the table, children had left toys and books on the floor, and life appeared to have frozen in an instant. Now, Golda Meir came to Palestine from the United States, where her family had fled in the wake of the pogroms in Eastern Europe, in Russia. And the sights she witnessed in in Haifa, reminded her of the worst stories of the pogroms that her family had described to her about Russian brutality under the Tsarist regime against the Jews decades earlier. So here we have the heart of the matter. And just to say, there is a contradiction at the heart of the Zionist project, which I think one or two other speakers have referred to. The contradiction is that if you look at the Holocaust, in the final analysis, and this is something I deal with in my chapter, the Holocaust was caused by the crisis of Western capitalism, the Great Depression, the way it hit Germany in the 1930s. The Nazis would not have come to power if not for the Great Depression of the early 30s. And Nazism is a product of the crisis of capitalism. Israel was created by and is completely supported and bolstered by Western capitalism. There's the contradiction at the heart of Zionism. I just want to say, coming out to more practical things that that Tony referred to, and Ronnie, the need to bolster and deepen our commitment to the BDS campaign. For example, as you mentioned, Camden, the PSC, and in Camden, for example, we are committed. We've got a campaign against Barclays Bank, which is complicit in the genocide, and also looking at the huge number of enormous national PSC mobilizations against the government's complicity. And I think we know now that the government has seen fit to cancel 30 arms deals with Israel. There still remains 320. Nevertheless, I don't believe that the British government would have cancelled those arms deals with Israel, with companies that supply arms to the Israeli state, if it hadn't been for those national mobilizations. So we've got to deepen our commitment to solidarity with the Palestinians, continue to campaign locally and nationally, so that eventually all arms trade with Israel is ended. But thank you very much for letting me speak, and thanks to all my fellow panelists.
We're going to move on now to the final 14 or 15 minutes of our meeting, and just ask each of our remaining speakers to provide their conclusions from what they've heard in the meeting today. And we'll go in the order of speaking, beginning with you, Ghada, please. Thank you.
Right, thank you. First of all, a big thank you to my fellow panelists who have been extremely informative. I've learned a lot, and I'm very glad that we find ourselves on the same platform speaking about this topic. Now, I want to, in a way, I suppose, sum up by giving you a Palestinian view of this whole issue. I think you won't be surprised if I tell you that for the Palestinians, Israel, the Holocaust, the angst that Jewish people go through, the psychological traumas, etc., are not the concern of the Palestinian people. I cannot stress that too strongly. This is not a question of being insensitive to the sufferings of others, or not wanting to know about Jewish history. It's none of that. It's the fact that, having used Palestine as the place where all these various problems were played out with the idea of solving them, is utterly unacceptable to Palestinians. There is no justification for imposing the state of the Jews, this Israel, on another people's territory and at their expense. I know that you all know this, but I cannot stress it more strongly. That does have consequences. It leads to a refusal to engage with the question of Holocaust history, what happened to the Jews in Europe, and all the rest of it. I don't exclude from that people who are genuinely interested in the history. That's of course taken for granted. The question is, what does this mean for the Palestinians? And I've said, number one, this whole idea that Palestine should be implicated whatsoever in this history is utterly rejected. Secondly, I would say, in response to my friend Ronny Kasrils, who quite rightly started to talk about what do we do, what are the steps for the future, I would say this. I think that those who want to help the Palestinians really do need to take on board what I just said, that Israel and its problems and its concerns are not the concerns of Palestinians and should not be played out at their expense. So therefore, what do we do with Israel? The reality is that we have a state which is undesirable, which nobody actually, and I'm being honest here, nobody would want in their backyard. Let's face it. And it's been imposed by force and by coercion on the Arab people of the region. So if we are all agreed that this state is actually undesirable, and that the way forward is to try and dismantle the state, this is what I mean. We need to think in terms of dismantling the Israeli state. It cannot be reformed, and it cannot be accepted as it is. Therefore, we have to think that it needs to be dismantled. It's to that end, I would invite activists, people who care about Palestine and the Palestinians, to try and bend their mind to. Now, that will involve some of the things that have already been mentioned, BDS, pressure on governments where people are living, all the usual forms of struggle, those must continue. But my point is that the end game has to be clear. It has to be clear. There is no thought of reforming Israel so we all live together. No, the Israeli state, in the way that it has not only been created and the role it has played throughout its life, which is utterly deleterious to the Arab region, that role, the whole thing has to come to an end. One last observation. It does not surprise me, and it should not surprise any of the people watching this, that the attempt to keep this state surviving has been, there's been an almost hysterical panic on the part of the West in order to keep this pawn, this capitalist, imperialist pawn, has to be kept going. And everything must be sacrificed in order for it to be kept going, including the deaths and destruction in Gaza and the West Bank, including the silencing of anybody who talks in a critical way against Israel. Ali Abu Nama, who is a good friend, has been deported. I'm told by the people who invited him that his crime, in inverted commas, that was provided by the Swiss for having arrested him is that he, and I quote, constituted a security risk he constituted a risk to the internal security of Switzerland. He hadn't opened his mouth. He didn't give a seminar. He didn't give a lecture. He never had a chance. So if you go to those lengths to preserve a state like the State of Israel, it's time, at least for us activists, and all of us who are on the right side of history, to say, right, no, we don't want to preserve this state, and we're not part of this endeavor.
Thank you, Ghada, for that really clear outline of what needs to happen. And I'll echo what Jules in the chat says. Well said, Ghada. And I'll pass on now to Stephen. Stephen, for your concluding comments, please. If you can unmute. Thank you. Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Well, I really agree with what Ghada just said now about the ultimate aim. The difficulty is how to get there. And I think last Saturday we had seen a sea change in the government's attitude, I think as expressed through nods and license, sort of some kind of background licensing given to the Metropolitan Police to become much more brutal and decisive against the usual protest marches, that we are going to have to up the resistance, because I think it appears that the attack on us is being increased to a great extent. And so probably we have to respond by even greater mobilization, so that it's dramatically showing an increase in the numbers on the street. And we have to run greater risks in resisting, and more civil disobedience along the lines of long time ago CND was doing. Even Bertrand Russell agreed that civil disobedience is appropriate at certain times. I think we have to think about seriously upping our reaction.
Thank you, Stephen, for that challenge. We'll move on now to Ronny. Of course, we'll have experience with this.
Yeah, well, I agree
Ronny,
with
the
need to absolutely intensify the struggle. What we can do internationally is mobilize against the Israeli state in every way, and that's through BDS, and to put inordinate pressure, maximum pressure on those governments that are supporting and keeping Israel alive. I agree with Ghada's approach about the objectives, which really is what I think she's referring to. For many of us, there's no question of keeping Israel alive. It doesn't deserve to exist. It's an artificial state. In fact, it's a colonial settler regime. And that means that there's a liberation struggle to overthrow colonialism and create a Palestinian country. It's for the Palestinians in the struggle together, one would hope, with the progressive Jews, no matter how small they might be, and we know that they're quite a number, and they're absolutely courageous, to sort out the type of society that they will build. And that's going to be a very, very tough one to deal with, but you've got to keep your eye on the correct approach. It would have been crazy for the South African people to have accepted a divided state at the end game, a state of Bantustans and the white apartheid state, or a white state of some kind. And that's what the white system wanted, the apartheid system, in the business community. The liberation movement stood firm. We refused that point blank. We must get behind the Palestinian people. The last point I'd like to make in a minute is that as bleak as things look, I think we know and understand that a struggle is extremely difficult depending on who you're struggling against and the power and strength that the oppressor has, the kind of support that Israel has. But the Palestinian people have a just struggle, and they are gaining the support of the world. But we've seen the extent to which the Palestinian people are absolutely so outstanding and committed to the freeing of their land. And although things might look grim now, struggles that go through their ups and their downs, their advances and their reverses. And we've seen such an incredible courage over all these years, and particularly now, the Palestinian people will find a way of organizing themselves in an even superior way to where they've come through now. They need greatest possible unity in their ranks and leadership, and I'm absolutely sure they will achieve that. For those of us who are living in the rest of the world, all we can do, the most we can do, is give our fullest support along the lines we've discussed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us and for your positive comments, Ronny. Thank you. And finally, we're moving over to Comrade Tony.
Okay, thank you, Esther. There are a number of comments I want to reply to from the people who contributed, and then I want to just take up what Ghada said. Firstly, to Abraham Weizfeld, there is no Jewish people any more than there is a Christian people or a Muslim people. I have nothing in common with the Argentinian Jew who speaks Spanish, or the French Jew who speaks French, or the Iraqi Jew who speaks Arab, apart from the fact that I'm of the same religion, the same religious descent. This idea that there was a Jewish nation was a Zionist idea, and it was on that basis that the Zionists could claim some form of self-determination. So yes, I am a Marxist, and it's because I'm a Marxist I reject this complete subjectivist empiricist nonsense. As regards Hitler not being as bad a racist as Churchill, I think you should disabuse yourself of it. Read Mein Kampf. Just have a look at the Nuremberg laws. They didn't just relegate Jews to second-class status. They relegated the Roma, who were also victims of the Holocaust. There was the disabled, who were also pilloried because of their infirmities. Black people, the so-called Rhineland bastards, were also in his sights. It's absolutely untrue. The fact that he made pacts with the Japanese and others is absolutely irrelevant. Actually, for South Africa's apartheid masters, the Japanese were Henri White. I think Ronnie will confirm. Yeah. Because racism has no scientific basis, of course you can find exceptions, but that doesn't change the overall thrust and direction of racism. I just wanted to take up briefly something Rana said, which I forgot to mention previously. She said, well, Palestinians react to the Star of David because they see that on every tank and every missile and every Israeli soldier. And she's absolutely correct. The Star of David, which was actually a minor Jewish symbol, the main symbol was the candelabra, not the Star of David. But the Star of David has been purloined, stolen by the Zionists to legitimize their state. It's blazoned on their flag. It's no surprise whatsoever that Palestinians will react to it. And any Jewish person who has any sensitivity will not display it for that reason. It's like the swastika. It was originally a peace symbol, but we now associate it with the Nazis. So people tend not to display it for that reason. And also, I mean, Palestinians will cry Yahud, Jew. It's not surprising because Israeli soldiers come to them as Jews. And I have considerable experience of this. But if I can just concentrate on what Ghada said, because I think it is interesting. Israel is a wholly illegitimate state because it's a Jewish supremacist state. It's a settler colonial state. It cannot be any other. A Jewish state in the land that belonged to the Palestinians can only mean a Jewish supremacist state. It's not a Jewish cultural state. It defines itself on the basis of ethnicity. Therefore, it must be an apartheid state. And it seems to me absolutely clear that the Palestinian solidarity movement has to completely abandon once and for all the notion of two states, the idea that a Jewish state and a Palestinian state can live in harmony together. They cannot. The very nature of the Israeli state leaves it to expand almost like a gas into a vacuum. The Syrian regime collapses, Israel invades. Lebanon, Israel invades. If Jordan collapses, Israel will invade. Israel will go into anywhere that it can, because of course the biblical land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, goes from the Litani in the north to the Euphrates to the east, and the Nile, the brook of the Nile to the south. So there's plenty more room for Israel to expand if it wants to. So Israel is the only state in the world without defined borders. And there is a reason for that, because it wishes to expand from the borders it has. And when Count Bernadotte came to Jerusalem in 1948, because the UN said Jerusalem should be internationalized, he was assassinated by Lehi with the support of David Ben-Gurion, because Israel doesn't want to negotiate anything. And we should not sow illusions. The Palestine Solidarity Movement, and that includes Britain's Palestine Solidarity Committee, has to be anti-Zionist. We have to take a position on the movement which led the dispossession of the Palestinians. You cannot fudge that. You cannot be an organization which simply is about human rights. I mean, if the anti-apartheid movement had said, well, we oppose the breach of human rights of black people in South Africa, but we're not going to take a position on apartheid, people would have laughed at them because apartheid was responsible for their condition. And the same is true of Zionism. Zionism drives the ethnic cleansing and its institutions, the Jewish National Fund, the Jewish Agency, the World Zionist Organization, they're all complicit. So we should be quite clear. We have to be anti-Zionist, and that means opposing a Jewish supremacist state, which is what Israel is. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. I know we need to close the meeting now.